once in an eternity. Just think of it, the whole of Russia has had its roof torn off, and you and I and everyone else are out in the open. And there's nobody to spy on us. Freedom. Real freedom. Not just talk about it. Freedom, dropped out of the sky. Freedom beyond our expectations. Freedom by accident, through a misunderstanding. And how great everyone is, and completely at sea. Have you noticed? As if crushed by his own weight, by the discovery of his greatness. Go on ironing, I tell you. Don't talk. You aren't bored. Let me change your iron for you. Last night I was watching the meeting in the square. An extraordinary sight. Mother Russia is on the move, she can't stand still, she's restless and she can't find rest, she's talking. And she can't stop. And it isn't as if only people were talking. Stars and trees meet and converse, flowers talk philosophy at night, stone houses hold meetings. It makes you think of the gospel, doesn't it? The days of the apostles. Remember Street. Paul? You will speak with tongues and you will prophesy. Pray for the gift of understanding. I know what you mean about stars and trees holding meetings. I understand that. It's happened to me too. It was partly the war, the revolution did the rest. The war was an artificial break in life, as if life could be put off for a time. What nonsense. The revolution broke out willy-nilly, like a sigh suppressed too long. Everyone was revived, reborn, changed, transformed. You might say that everyone has been through two revolutions, his own personal revolution as well as the general one. It seems to me that socialism is the sea, and all these separate streams, these private, individual revolutions, are flowing into it, the sea of life, the sea of spontaneity. I said life, but I mean life as you see it in a great picture, transformed by genius, creatively enriched. Only now people have decided to experience it not in books and pictures but in themselves, not as an abstraction but in practice. The sudden trembling of his voice betrayed his rising agitation. Antipova stopped ironing and gave him a grave, astonished look. It confused him and he forgot what he was saying. After a moment of embarrassed silence he rushed on, blurting out whatever came into his head. These days I have such a longing to live honestly, to be productive. I so much want to be a part of all this awakening. And then, in the middle of all this general rejoicing, I catch your mysterious, sad glance, wandering God knows where, far away. How I wish it were not there. How I wish your face to say that you are happy with your fate and that you need nothing from anyone. If only someone who is really close to you. Your friend or your husband, best of all if he were a soldier, would take me by the hand and tell me to stop worrying about your fate and not to weary you with my attentions. But I'd rest my hand free and take a swing. I have forgotten myself. Please forgive me. Once again the doctor's voice betrayed him. He gave up struggling and, feeling hopelessly awkward, got up and went to the window. Leaning on the sill, his cheek on his hand, he stared into the dark garden with absent, unseeing eyes, trying to collect himself. Antipova walked round the ironing board, propped between the table and the other window, and stopped in the middle of the room a few steps behind him. That's what I've always been afraid of, she said softly, as if to herself. I shouldn't have. Don't, Yurii Andreevich, you mustn't. Oh, now just look at what you've made me do, she exclaimed. She ran back to the board, where a thin stream of acrid smoke came from under the iron that had burned through a blouse. She thumped it down crossly on its stand. Yurii Andreevich, she went on, do be sensible, go off to Mademoiselle for a minute, have a drink of water and come back, please, as I've always known you till now and as I want you to be. Do you hear, Yurii Andreevich? I know you can do it. Please do it. I beg you." They had no more talks of this kind, and a week later Larissa Fyodorovna left. 9. Sometime later, Zhivago too set out for home. The night before he left there was a terrible storm. The roar of the gale merged with that of the downpour, which sometimes crashed straight onto the roofs and at other times drove down the street with the changing wind as if lashing its way step by step. The peals of thunder followed each other uninterruptedly, producing a steady rumble. In the blaze of continual flashes of lightning the street vanished into the distance, and the bent trees seemed to be running in the same direction. Mademoiselle Fleury was waked up in the night by an urgent knocking at the front door. She sat up in alarm and listened. The knocking went on. Could it be, she thought, that there wasn't a soul left in the hospital to get up and open the door? Did she always have to do everything, poor old woman, just because nature had made her reliable and endowed her with a sense of duty? Well, admittedly, the house had belonged to rich aristocrats, but what about the hospital didn't that belong to the people, wasn't it their own? Whom did they expect to look after it? Where, for instance, had the male nurses got to, she'd like to know. Everyone had fled, no more orderlies, no more nurses, no doctors, no one in authority. Yet there were still wounded in the house, 2 legless men in the surgical ward where the drawing room used to be, and downstairs next to the laundry the storeroom full of dysentery cases. And that devil Ustinia had gone out visiting. She knew perfectly well that there was a storm coming, but did that stop her? Now she had a good excuse to spend the night out. Well, thank God the knocking had stopped. They realized that nobody would answer, they'd given it up. Why anybody should want to be out in this weather? Or could it be Ustinia? No, she had her key. Oh God, how terrible, they've started again. What pigs, just the same. Not that you could expect Zhivago to hear anything, he was off tomorrow, his thoughts were already in Moscow or on the journey. But what about Galiolin? How could he sleep soundly or lie calmly through all this noise, expecting that in the end she, a weak, defenseless old woman, would go down and open for God knows whom, on this frightening night in this frightening country? Galiolin. She remembered suddenly. No, such nonsense could occur to her only because she was half asleep. Galiolin wasn't there, he should be a long way off by now. Hadn't she herself, with Zhivago, hidden him, and disguised him as a civilian, and then told him about every road and village in the district to help him to escape after that horrible lynching at the station when they killed Commissar Gintz and chased Galiolin all the way from Bariuchi to Meliutsevo, shooting at him and then hunting for him all over the town. If it hadn't been for those automobiles, not a stone would have been left standing in the town. An armored division happened to be passing through, and stopped those evil men. The storm was subsiding, moving away. The thunder was less continuous, duller, more distant. The rain stopped occasionally, when the water could be heard splashing softly off the leaves and down the gutters. Noiseless reflections of distant lightning lit up Mademoiselle's room, lingering as though looking for something. Suddenly the knocking at the front door, which had long since stopped, was resumed. Someone was in urgent need of help and was knocking repeatedly, in desperation. The wind rose again and the rain came down. "Coming," shouted Mademoiselle to whoever it was, and the sound of her own voice frightened her. It had suddenly occurred to her who it might be. Putting down her feet and pushing them into slippers, she threw her dressing gown over her shoulders and hurried to wake up Zhivago. It would be less frightening if he came down with her. But he had heard the knocking and was already coming down with a lighted candle. The same idea had occurred to both of them. Zhivago, Zhivago, they're knocking on the front door. I'm afraid to go down alone," she called out in French, adding in Russian, "You will see, it's either La or Lieutenant Gale." Roused by the knocking, Yurii Andreevich had also felt certain that it was someone he knew, either Galeolin, who had been stopped in his flight and was coming back for refuge, or Nurse Antipova, prevented from continuing her journey for some reason. In the hallway the doctor gave the candle to Mademoiselle, drew the bolts, and turned the key. A gust of wind burst the door open, putting out the candle and showering them with cold raindrops. "Who is it? Who is it? Anybody there?" Mademoiselle and the doctor shouted in turn into the darkness, but there was no reply. Suddenly the knocking started again in another place. Was it at the back door, or, as they now thought, at the French window into the garden? "Must be the wind," said the doctor. "But just to make sure, perhaps you'd have a look at the back. I'll stay here in case there really is someone." Mademoiselle disappeared into the house while the doctor went out and stood under the entrance roof. His eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, and he could make out the first signs of dawn. Above the town, clouds raced dementedly as if pursued, so low that their tatters almost caught the tops of the trees, which bent in the same direction so that they looked like brooms sweeping the sky. The rain lashed the wooden wall of the house, turning it from grey to black. Mademoiselle came back. "Well?" said the doctor. "You were right. There's no one." She had been all around the house. A branch knocking on the pantry window had broken one of the panes and there were huge puddles on the floor, and the same thing in what used to be Lara's room. There was a sea, a real sea, an ocean. And on this side, look, there's a broken shutter knocking on the casement, do you see it? That's all it was. They talked a little, locked the door, and went back to their rooms, both regretting that the alarm had been a false one. They had been sure that when they opened the door, Antipova would come in, chilled through and soaked to the skin. And they would ask her dozens of questions while she took off her things. And she would go and change and come down and dry herself in front of the kitchen stove, still warm from last night, and would tell them her adventures, pushing back her hair and laughing. They had been so sure of it that after locking the front door they imagined that she was outside the house in the form of a watery wraith, and her image continued to haunt them. 10. It was said that the Boriuchi telegrapher, Kolya Frelenko, was indirectly responsible for the trouble at the station. Kolya, the son of a well-known Melyutsevo clockmaker, had been a familiar figure in Melyutsevo from his earliest childhood. As a small boy he had stayed with some of the servants at Razdanois and had played with the countess's daughters. It was then that he learned to understand French. Mademoiselle Fleury knew him well. Everyone in Melyutsevo was used to seeing him on his bicycle, coatless, hatless, and in canvas summer shoes in any weather. Arms crossed on his chest, he free-wheeled down the road, glancing up at the poles and wires to check the condition of the network. Some of the houses in Melyutsevo were connected by a branch line with the exchange at the station. The calls were handled by Kolya at the station switchboard. There he was up to his ears in work. For not only the telephone and telegraph were in his charge. But, if the station master Poverihan was absent for a few moments, also the railway signals, which were operated from the same control room. Having to look after several mechanical instruments at once, Kolya had evolved a special style of speech, obscure, abrupt, and puzzling, which enabled him, if he chose, to avoid answering questions or getting involved in a conversation. He was said to have abused the advantage this gave him on the day of the disorders. It is true that, by suppressing information, he had defeated Galeolin's good intentions and, perhaps unwittingly, had given a fatal turn to the events. Galeolin had called up from town and asked for Commissar Gintz, who was somewhere at the station or in its vicinity, in order to tell him that he was on his way to join him and to ask him to wait for him and do nothing until he arrived. Kolya, on the pretext that he was busy signaling an approaching train, refused to call the commissar. At the same time he did his utmost to delay the train, which was bringing up the Cossacks summoned to Buriuchi. When the troops arrived, nevertheless, he did not conceal his dismay. The engine, crawling slowly under the dark roof of the platform, stopped in front of the huge window of the control room. Kolya drew the green serge curtain with the initials of the company woven in yellow into the border, picked up the enormous water jug standing on the tray on the window ledge, poured some water into the plain, thick, straight-sided glass, drank a few mouthfuls, and looked out. The engineer saw him from his cab and gave him a friendly nod. The stinker, the louse, Kolya thought with hatred. He stuck out his tongue and shook his fist. The engineer not only understood him but managed to convey by a shrug of the shoulders and a nod in the direction of the train. What was I to do? I'd like to know what you'd have done in my place. He's the boss. You're a filthy brute all the same, Kolya replied by gestures. The horses were taken, balking, out of the freight cars. The thud of their hoofs on the wooden gangways was followed by the ring of their shoes on the stone platform. They were led, rearing, across the tracks.